The year is 2007. In the sweltering heat of the Orinoco River Belt in eastern Venezuela, the air smells of sulfur, wet earth, and infinite money. This vast stretch of territory, covering over 55,000 square kilometers, holds the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. It contains more hydrocarbon capability than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia, and more than the United States. Under the ground lies a thick, viscous sludge known as extra-heavy crude. It is difficult to extract, difficult to transport, and difficult to refine. But in a world where the price of a barrel of oil is marching steadily toward $100, it represents the ultimate geopolitical weapon. At this moment in history, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela is not a cautionary tale of economic collapse. It is a titan. It is the wealthiest nation in South America. Its capital, Caracas, is awash in petrodollars, importing Ferraris, Scotch whiskey, and political influence across the hemisphere. At the helm of this petrostate stands Hugo Chavez. He is at the absolute zenith of his political power. He has survived a coup attempt, won re-election by a landslide, and consolidated control over the military and the judiciary. But he does not yet fully control the oil. The specific geology of the Orinoco Belt requires advanced technology to monetize. The crude is so heavy, with an API gravity of less than 10 degrees, that it is essentially a solid at room temperature. To turn this sludge into money, it requires massive industrial complexes called upgraders that heat, treat, and dilute the oil before it can be shipped to refineries. In the 1990s, under a policy known as the Apertura petrolera, or oil opening, the previous Venezuelan government realized it lacked the capital and technology to do this alone. They invited the supermajors of the West, ExxonMobil, ConocoPhillips, Chevron, Total, and Statoil, to enter the country. These corporations poured billions of dollars into building the infrastructure, signing contracts that gave them majority operational control and favorable tax rates. For the international oil companies, the Orinoco Belt was the jewel in their global portfolios. It was a long-term cash machine. For Chavez, however, these contracts were a humiliation. They were remnants of a neoliberal past that he had sworn to dismantle. He viewed the presence of American and European corporations controlling Venezuelan resources not as a partnership, but as a violation of sovereignty. In his vision, oil was not a commodity. It was a political instrument, and the state must possess absolute, uncompromising dominion over every molecule. The decision that forms in the presidential palace of Miraflores in early 2007 is not a sudden impulse. It is the culmination of a strategic doctrine dubbed full oil sovereignty. The plan is bold, theatrical, and irreversible. The state will forcibly seize majority control of all projects in the Orinoco Belt. The foreign companies will be given an ultimatum. They must accept a downgrade to minority partners, hand over operational control to the state oil company, PDVSA, and accept a massive tax hike. Or they can leave. This is the decision that will eventually cost the nation hundreds of billions of dollars in lost revenue, legal penalties, and destroyed infrastructure. It is the moment Venezuela decides to trade technical competence for political supremacy. And at the center of this storm, two American giants, ExxonMobil and Chevron, will make two very different choices, defining the trajectory of the Venezuelan collapse. To understand the magnitude of the gamble, one must understand the entity that was being dismantled. Before the politicization of the mid-2000s, PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela, S.A., was widely considered the most efficient state-owned oil company in the world. It was run by technocrats, geologists, and engineers who prided themselves on a meritocratic culture. It was often described as a state within a state, operating with a level of independence that shielded it from the chaotic whims of Latin American politics. But to the Chavista government, this independence was the problem. A company that prioritized efficiency and reinvestment over social spending and political loyalty was viewed as an enemy. Following the oil strike of 2002-2003, the government had already fired nearly 20,000 PDVSA employees, the brain drain that stripped the company of its institutional memory. By 2007, the government was ready to take the final step, seizing the assets of the foreign partners who were keeping the Orinoco production afloat. On May 1, 2007, Labor Day, the theater of the decision, begins. Hugo Chavez sends the military to occupy the oil fields. Fighter jets fly overhead. Soldiers with assault rifles patrol the perimeter of the massive upgrading facilities that were built with American and French capital. Red flags are raised over the installations. In a televised speech, Chavez declares the end of the oil opening. He announces that the strategic associations of the 1990s are dead. The companies are given a deadline to sign new mixed enterprise contracts, in which PDVSA will hold a minimum of 60% equity. The terms are non-negotiable. The message is clear. The party is over. Inside the boardrooms of Houston, Paris, and San Ramon, the executives of the supermajors face a binary choice. The financial models for these projects were based on decades of stability. The retroactive changes destroy the economics. But the oil in the ground is still worth trillions. The question becomes one of risk versus pride, and legal principle versus operational pragmatism. This is where the divergence occurs. On one side stands ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. Exxon, the descendant of Standard Oil, operates with a rigid, almost quasi-governmental foreign policy of its own. Their corporate culture is built on the sanctity of contracts. They view the Venezuelan ultimatum not just as a bad deal, but as theft. They calculate that if they capitulate to Venezuela, they set a dangerous precedent for their operations in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Africa. If a government can tear up a contract and seize assets without consequence, the entire global model of energy investment collapses. ConocoPhillips, which has the largest exposure to the Orinoco Belt with heavy investments in the Jamaica and Petrozuata projects, takes a similar stance. They refuse to sign the new terms. They refuse to accept the minority stake. They refuse to hand over operations to a PDVSA management team they view as increasingly incompetent. So ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips choose the nuclear option. They walk away. They abandon billions of dollars in heavy equipment, pipelines, and upgraders. They immediately file for international arbitration at the World Bank's ICSID, International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, and the International Chamber of Commerce. They freeze Venezuelan assets abroad. They declare a legal war that will haunt Venezuela's balance sheet for the next 2 decades. On the other side of the table sits Chevron. The culture at Chevron is different. Under the guidance of executives like Ali Moshiri, the head of Chevron's Latin American operations, the company adopts a strategy of extreme pragmatism. Moshiri is a man who understands the personal dynamics of the region. He has cultivated a relationship with the Venezuelan leadership. His philosophy is distinct. We are an oil company, not a political party. Chevron looks at the same ultimatum and sees a different reality. They realize that leaving means writing off the investment entirely, with only a slim hope of recovering money through tribunals years down the road. Staying, even as a minority partner, keeps a foot in the door. It gives them access to the reserves. It allows them to book the oil on their global reserve statement, which supports their stock price. Chevron calculates that regimes come and go, but the geology remains. If they can maintain a presence, they will be there when the pendulum swings back. So while Exxon packs its bags, Chevron signs the new contract. They accept the minority position. They stand on the stage with the government officials. They agree to transfer operational control of the Jamaica project, renamed Petropiar, to PDVSA. Total, France, and Statoil, Norway, also decide to stay, though with reduced stakes. The immediate aftermath of the May 1st takeover, the honeymoon phase, appears to vindicate the government's decision. For a few years, the cracks in the system are plastered over by the greatest commodity boom in history. In 2008, oil prices spiked to $147 a barrel. Revenue floods into the Venezuelan treasury at a rate that is almost impossible to spend. The government uses the windfall to fund massive social programs, subsidize food, and cement alliances across the Caribbean through Petrocaribe, providing cheap oil to allies in exchange for political support. In this environment, the exit of Exxon and Conoco seems irrelevant. Who needs American technicians when oil is selling for triple digits? The government triumphantly renames the seized projects. The Sincor project becomes Petrocideno. The Cerro Negro project becomes Petromonagas. The narrative is one of liberation. The state now owns the oil, pumps the oil, and keeps the profit. The cautionary warnings from industry analysts that heavy oil requires constant high-tech maintenance that PDVSA is no longer capable of providing are drowned out by the noise of the bonanza. However, the decision to nationalize and expel the technically competent partners triggers a slow, invisible mechanism of decay. The consequences do not arrive as a sudden explosion, but as a gradual grinding down of the industrial gears. The core issue is the complexity of the Orinoco crude. This is not the light, sweet oil of Saudi Arabia that shoots out of the ground under its own pressure. This is tar. To move it, you need to inject diluents like naphtha to thin it out. To process it, you need the massive upgraders to be running at peak efficiency to strip out the sulfur and heavy metals. When Exxon and Conoco left, they took their proprietary technology, their supply chains, and their maintenance protocols with them. PDVSA, now in charge of operations, begins to cut corners. The skilled engineers who knew how to run these complex plants are replaced by political appointees. Maintenance schedules are ignored to maximize short-term cash flow. Revenue that should be reinvested into the fields, to drill new wells, to repair pipelines, to buy spare parts, is instead siphoned off directly to the central government to pay for social spending and debt service. The first sign of the rot is the decline in the upgraders. These multi-billion-dollar facilities begin to suffer frequent breakdowns and fires. Without the ability to upgrade the crude into higher-value synthetic oil, PDVSA is forced to sell the raw, extra-heavy sludge at a steep discount, or blend it with imported light crude just to make it flow. This destroys the margins. Venezuela, a country sitting on the largest oil reserves in the world, begins to import light oil from the United States and Nigeria just to keep its own production moving. Then comes the corruption. With the foreign oversight of Exxon and Conoco removed, and the remaining partners like Chevron marginalized into minority roles with no veto power, the procurement processes in the Orinoco Belt become a black hole. Billions of dollars are allocated for equipment that never arrives. Ghost companies are set up to bill PDVSA for services never rendered. The mixed enterprises become mechanisms for looting the state. Chevron, sitting on the board of Apertura, watches this unfold. They have limited power to stop it. Their strategy of staying in the game forces them to become silent witnesses to the systematic dismantling of the industry they helped build. They focus on protecting their specific joint venture, insulating Apertura as much as possible from the chaos consuming the rest of the network. But they are swimming against the tide. The turning point, the moment the bill for the 2007 decision finally arrives, is the oil price crash of 2014. When the price of crude collapses from over $100 to under $30, the illusion of stability evaporates instantly. A well-run oil company saves money during the boom to survive the bust. But PDVSA had been stripped bare. There is no savings fund, there is no maintenance budget, and crucially, production capacity has been quietly collapsing for years. In 1998, Venezuela produced over 3 million barrels per day. By 2015, despite the massive reserves of the Orinoco, production is plummeting. The lack of drilling, the lack of water injection, and the breakdown of the upgraders means that once the pressure drops, it cannot be restored. The fields are dying. Simultaneously, the legal consequences of the expulsion of Exxon and Conoco come back to haunt the nation. The international arbitration tribunals issue their rulings. They find that the 2007 takeover was an unlawful expropriation. Venezuela is ordered to pay billions in compensation. ExxonMobil is awarded roughly $1.6 billion, later adjusted, and ConocoPhillips is awarded over $8 billion. These are catastrophic sums for a nation now entering a liquidity crisis. ConocoPhillips, aggressive and relentless, moves to seize PDVSA's assets in the Caribbean. They freeze oil cargoes. They target the Citgo refineries in the United States. The legal warfare strangles PDVSA's ability to export oil, forcing ships to play a cat-and-mouse game to avoid seizure. By 2017, the situation descends into a humanitarian and industrial catastrophe. The once gleaming facilities of the Orinoco Belt are rusting in the jungle humidity. Pipelines leak crude into the rivers. The workers who remain are starving, their salaries pulverized by hyperinflation. They lack boots, helmets, and gloves. They faint on the job from hunger. The sovereignty obtained in 2007 has resulted in a production level comparable to the 1940s. The industry has effectively committed suicide. Chevron's role in this final phase becomes a surreal exercise in survival. As U.S. sanctions against the Venezuelan government tighten in 2019, most remaining Western service companies, Halliburton, Schlumberger, pull out. But Chevron lobbies the U.S. Treasury for a special exemption, known as General License 41. Their argument to the State Department echoes their argument to Chavez a decade earlier. If we leave, the Russians and the Chinese will take over entirely. If we leave, the infrastructure will collapse completely, and there will be nothing left to rebuild when the regime eventually changes. The U.S. government agrees. Chevron becomes the last American oil major in the country, a lonely outpost in a devastated landscape. However, the cost of the decision remains astronomical. It is not just the arbitration awards or the lost revenue from the years of decline. The true cost is the destruction of the potential. Between 2007 and 2020, the world consumed more oil than at any time in history. This was a period where Venezuela should have earned trillions of dollars. Instead, its production fell from 3.2 million barrels a day to less than 700,000. The difference between what was produced and what could have been produced represents a loss of wealth so staggering it is difficult to comprehend. Estimates range from $300 billion to $500 billion in lost opportunity. The nationalization of 2007 was sold as a reclamation of dignity. It was framed as the final victory of the state over the rapacious foreign capital. But the mechanics of the oil business are indifferent to ideology. Oil requires capital, it requires technology, and it requires competent management. By expelling the partners who provided these inputs and replacing them with a politicized bureaucracy, the Venezuelan state didn't gain control of the oil, they suffocated it. The contrast between the companies is stark in the aftermath. ExxonMobil took its capital and deployed it elsewhere, discovering massive world-class reserves in Guyana, Venezuela's neighbor. In a twist of geological irony, Exxon is now pumping hundreds of thousands of barrels a day of high-quality, low-cost oil just across the border, creating a new economic boom in Guyana, while the Venezuelan side of the border remains in darkness. ConocoPhillips aggressively pursued its debt and recovered billions through asset seizures. And Chevron? Chevron survives. They are still there, operating Petro-PR, navigating the sanctions, pumping what they can. They proved that presence is possible, but they also proved that presence without operational control in a collapsing state is a limited victory. They are the caretakers of a ruin, keeping the pilot light on in a factory that has largely burned down. The decision to nationalize the Orinoco Belt in 2007 stands as one of the most expensive unforced errors in economic history. It demonstrates that resource nationalism, when divorced from technical reality and fiscal discipline, is not a path to sovereignty, but a path to poverty. The billions of barrels of oil are still there, trapped in the sand, beneath the rusting pipes and the silence of the empty upgraders. The state owns all of it 100%. And because of that, it is worth almost nothing. The tragedy is not simply financial. It is the dismantling of a nation's future. The revenue that vanished was the money that would have built hospitals, schools, and power grids. It was the money that would have insulated the country from the inevitable volatility of the market. Instead, the decision created a hollow shell, a petro-state without petrol, a rich country with poor people, and a sovereign nation dependent on the charity of creditors. The executives in the glass towers of Houston moved on to the next deal. The people of Venezuela were left with the consequences. The story of the Orinoco Belt is a testament to the fragility of wealth. It shows that natural resources are not wealth in themselves. They are merely opportunity. Wealth is the capacity to organize, to manage, and to sustain complex systems. When the decision was made to prioritize politics over that capacity, the outcome was predetermined. The check was signed in 2007. The payment is still being made today, every single day, by a population living in the shadow of the fortune that was squandered. The decision that cost billions was, in the end, the decision to ignore how the world actually works. The oil industry is often described as a long-term business, operating in quarter-century cycles. In that timeline, The period from 2007 to the present is a blink of an eye, yet it contained the complete rise and fall of a superpower's ambition. The lesson, written in the rusted infrastructure of Anzoátegui State, is that you can nationalize a company, you can seize a rig, and you can expropriate a refinery, but you cannot nationalize competence, and you cannot decree geology to obey a political timeline. As the sun sets over the Orinoco today, the flares from the few remaining active wells flicker in the darkness. They are not the roaring fires of industry they once were. They are distress signals. Chevron's engineers monitor the pressure gauges, ensuring the flow continues, however diminished. Across the border in Guyana, Exxon's drill ships illuminate the horizon, tapping into the same geological basin with ruthless efficiency. The two divergent paths, one of departure and one of endurance, highlight the complexity of the global energy game. But neither strategy could save Venezuela from itself. The decision was internal, the cost was total, and the bill has yet to be fully paid. This was not a failure of the resource. The oil is innocent. It was a failure of the mind. A failure to recognize that in the high-stakes poker game of energy geopolitics, the player with the best hand can still lose everything if they don't know how to play the cards. The 2007 nationalization was the moment Venezuela went all in on a bluff, believing that the price of oil would solve all problems forever. When the bluff was called, the chips were already gone. To look at the charts of Venezuela's oil production is to look at the vital signs of a dying patient. The steep cliff that begins after 2015 is not just a line on a graph. It is the visual representation of the decision made years earlier. It is the lag time between the cause and the effect. The cause was the hubris of 2007. The effect was the starvation of 2018. The years in between were the illusion, the time when the momentum of the past disguised the destruction of the future. The role of the foreign companies was ultimately secondary. They were actors on a stage built by the state. Exxon's departure accelerated the collapse and Chevron's presence cushioned it slightly. But the trajectory was set by the decree. The decision to break the contract was the decision to break the industry. And in a petro-state, when you break the industry, you break the nation. The silence that hangs over the abandoned upgraders in the Orinoco Belt is the loudest sound in the global energy market. A monument to the decision that cost billions. Disclaimer. The Grid Point Zero provides technical analysis and independent research for educational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented in this video is based on publicly available data and professional projections as of early 2026. This content does not constitute financial, legal, investment, or emergency preparedness advice. The Grid Point Zero is not responsible for any actions, investments, or decisions made based on the information provided in this video. Always perform your own due diligence and consult with licensed professionals for specific advice. Understand the systems. Prepare for the disconnect.